So now we know how to style our components. And again, we're definitely not done here. This is not the final look I want to have. But before we dig deeper into tweaking the final look and adding more UI elements, let's think about one maybe obvious problem. We will probably not just have one expense, and definitely not an expense where the data is just hard-coded into the component as it is here. The date is hard-coded here, the title is hard-coded, the amount is hard-coded, and it's the only expense we have. In our final tracker, we want to have an unlimited amount of expenses if we want to. We want to have multiple expense item components in action. And after all, that is one of the core ideas behind components. It's not just the separation of concerns, it's also the reusability. We want to define a component and its HTML code once, and then we want to be able to reuse it. And at the moment, we're not able to do that. Therefore, that will be the next problem we'll work on. But before we work on that, there's another problem which we have to solve first. And that's something I just mentioned, that all that data is hard-coded here in this JSX code. This is unrealistic. Some data may be hard-coded sometimes, but here for an expense item, something like the date and the title and the amount would typically be dynamic, which means it's not hard-coded in the HTML code. Instead, we receive that data from somewhere, for example, from the user who entered it into a form, and we then output it dynamically. Now, for the moment, we don't have the capabilities yet to receive it from the user, but we can fake dynamic data by at least adding more than just HTML code to this component. Because after all, we must not forget that a component in React is just a function. And that earlier I mentioned that components are the combination of HTML, to some extent CSS, and also JavaScript. Now we definitely see HTML in action. We also saw some CSS being added, but where's the JavaScript other than that being a function? Well, let's add some JavaScript code in that function before we return. For example, let's add a constant, so a variable which may never change, and in there, let's store a date by using the built-in date constructor, which comes with JavaScript. Let's give this constant a name. For example, expense date sounds like a fitting name. And then let's maybe set an initial date value here, which is the year 2021, March as a month, and since the month field here starts at 0, March has the number 2, and then there, the 28th. This is how we can create such a date object, and this, and that's really important to me, is just regular JavaScript. Has nothing to do with React. And we can, and we typically do, have JavaScript code like this in our components. Here, just to create some dummy data. Later in the course and in your React applications, that could be any kind of code. For example, to send a HTTP request and fetch data from a database, to validate user input, or to do any other kind of task. So here we have our expense date. We can also have our expense title here, which is maybe car insurance. So a simple string stored in this constant. And then our expense amount, which is, let's say, a number, 294.67. So we have these three constants, regular JavaScript code, and we now want to output these values here in this HTML code. And that is a typical task. Typically, you don't have data hard-coded in HTML. Instead, to output dynamic data, you use a special syntax React gives you inside of these JSX code snippets. You can replace hard-coded data with opening and closing curly braces. Single curly braces, opening and closing. And the special thing about these curly braces inside of your JSX code snippets is that in these curly braces, between them, you can run basic JavaScript expressions. For example, 1 plus 1. You can execute something like this there, and it's now the result of this expression, which will be output on the screen. So if I run 1 plus 1 between curly braces here, we see 2. We can also do something like math random here and generate a random number with the built-in math object. And we see the number here. And every time I reload, I get a new number, of course. Now that's something we can do. Now here, I don't want to get a random number. I don't want to add 1 plus 1. Instead, I want to refer to the value stored in this constant. And therefore, we can just repeat that constant name here. This is also a valid JavaScript expression, just pointing at a variable or a constant, in this case a constant. And now JavaScript will extract the value stored in this constant and basically inject it here into this HTML code, so to say. So if I now save that, we again see car insurance here just like before, but now it's not hard-coded in the HTML code, but instead here it's output dynamically and the concrete value is taken from that constant. There, of course, it's still hard-coded, but it's just a first step. Now we can do the same for the amount. So here, after the $sign, which I will leave hard-coded for now, we can point at expense amount. And for the date, we can do something similar. Here, we can output expense date, though for the date, we have to keep in mind that it's a date object. And therefore, if we try to save it like this, it just breaks. Because this being a date object, it can't be output as text like this. However, we can call toISOString, for example, a built-in method available on all date objects, to output it as a string, and now we see this at least. Not super readable, but a first step. Now we will refine and fine-tune the way this is being output later. For the moment, we just achieved one important thing. We now no longer work with hard-coded text in our HTML code, but instead we have these dynamic placeholders, you could say, where the concrete value can be the result of a calculation, of a HTTP request, or, as it is here at the moment, the value stored in a constant or variable. And now with that out of the way, we can move on and we can take a closer look at how we can make this expense item more reusable, so that it's not always the same data which we're outputting, and so that we can have multiple expense items based on one and the same component with different data. How can we make this component reusable? Well, the good news is we can already reuse it. In app.js, where I'm using it, we can simply copy that line and paste it in, and if we save everything, we got 2 expense items already. So that was easy. It's super easy to reuse a component. You can use it as often as you want. You can add it 2 more times and have 4 expense items overall. That will work. But of course, at the moment, it's not really reusable. Yes, it's technically more than once, but it's always displaying the same data. And the reason for that is that the data is baked into this component. Now, think about regular JavaScript without React for a second. There, I mentioned earlier already, we also use functions to split functionality across multiple smaller code bases, and also to have reusable functions which we can call multiple times. Now, when we write functions in JavaScript, then we make these functions reusable by accepting parameters. And that allows us to call one and the same function with different parameter values. And therefore, the function may and typically will produce different results for different input values, but it's still always the same function being called. And React basically has the same concept built in. We can make our components reusable by using parameters and a concept called props in React. Let's say in your app component, you have a goal item variable or constant defined, which holds a string of finish. And then let's say you have a custom component, the course goal item component, which has a list item inside of it, where this goal item should be output. That's just another example, not the code we've been working on, but it's another example. We can have a custom component which should output a list item where the goal item should be output dynamically. The problem is that the goal item variable lives in the app component, not in the course goal item component. And to a certain extent that is good, because it makes the course goal item independent if it doesn't store the concrete value internally. But of course, we want to define what's being output by a course goal item with help of the variable managed in app. And we don't have direct access to the HTML code output by some component in other components. We can't just send our stored data there. But instead, we can utilize a concept called props. We can pass data to the custom component by adding an attribute. And inside of that component, we can then get access to all these attributes which might have been set on our custom component. Again, we're basically building our own custom HTML elements. And just as HTML elements can have attributes, it turns out that with React, our own custom components can also have attributes. There, this concept is just called props instead of attributes. And props simply stands for properties. We can set properties of our own custom components. Now, how does this props concept work though? In expense item, we have the date, the title, and the amount, and we'd like to output this here. But it shouldn't be stored in here, but instead in app.js. There, indeed, in this app component, we could have another constant or variable, expenses, which is an array, so multiple expense items. And let's say every expense here is a simple JavaScript object, which now has a title like car insurance, which also has an amount like the 294.67, and where we have a date like this new date we created here in expense item before. Now again, we don't just have one, but we have, let's say, 3 such expenses here, or maybe 4. Now, to make sure we don't have to type this all by hand, attached you find a simple text file which contains 4 dummy expense items, which you can just grab and copy into your expenses array. These objects also have an extra ID field, which we don't need at the moment though. Nonetheless, now you will have 4 objects inside of this expenses array. And now we want to pass the data of these different objects to these different expense items. That means we want to make these expense items configurable from outside, you could say. The data should not be stored inside of them, but instead received from outside. And that works with this props concept I just mentioned. In app.js, we can simply add attributes to these custom HTML elements, so to these components. I'm using these terms interchangeably here. And for example, we could add a title attribute here to expense item and set this to a value of toilet paper. So we can just type toilet paper here. But now I would in the end again be hard coding some data in this JSX code. Since we already have this expenses array here, I also can dynamically retrieve the title stored in this first expense item for this first expense item here. And we can do this by again using this single curly brace syntax. We can not just use this between opening and closing tags of elements, we can also use it for assigning values to attributes. And here I can then access expenses, which is this array, there the first item with index 0, and there this first item, like all items, is an object which has a title property, for example. So we can access dot title here. And now this title is being passed to this expense item. Now we can do the same for the amount. We set, let's say, an amount attribute. And these attribute names, by the way, are totally up to you. I'm going with title and amount here, but you could pick different names. And as a value for amount, I again access expenses and the first expense there, and then the amount field. And last but not least, we can add a date attribute and access expenses and there the first expense dot date. You just have to make sure that the part after the dot matches the property names here because we are accessing these objects. Now I'll hit the auto format code to make this easier to read by splitting this across multiple lines. And we can now do the same for the other expense items. So I'll just repeat this, but then access the second expense here and the third expense with index 2 and the fourth expense with index 3. Now if we save that, we see no change though, because we only did the first half of the work we need to do. We added these attributes with any names of our choice here because these are our custom elements. Hence these attribute names are up to us. But inside of that component code, so inside of expense item.js, we also now need to do something with these received attribute values. And that's the half which is missing. Now the question is, how do we get access to the values defined in the place where we use our custom components? And the answer is parameters. I mentioned that in regular JavaScript, we use parameters for passing data into functions, and it's kind of similar for React. However, we're now not getting a title and an amount and a date parameter, as you might think, but instead we get one parameter. React will ensure that we get one parameter in every component which we use as a component, like we're doing it here for expense item. And that one parameter will be an object which holds all the received attributes as properties. Hence the name props for the overall concept. Therefore, we get one parameter, and you can name this parameter whatever you want. It's your function. You could name it data. But typically it's named props to make it clear that this is this object which holds all the values we get for the attributes on our custom element. And to be precise, we get key value pairs in this props object here, which is passed in by React automatically. The keys will be the attribute names defined here, so title, amount, and date in my case, and the values, of course, will be the values set here. So if I now want to output the title received, here in this h2 tag, I can now access props.title, like this. Getting access to this props parameter, and then there to the title property, which will exist because we set a title attribute. Now, if you chose a different name than title here, like for example, name, if you chose that as a name, for example, then you have to access props.name here. So the key which you access on your props object has to be the name you picked for your attribute. Now here I'll go back to title and therefore adjust it here in both places again, but you have to make sure that this matches. Otherwise it'll not work. Now which names you choose, if that's title or name or text or whatever, that's up to you. It's your component. But of course you typically want to choose prop names and therefore attribute names which are self-explanatory and which makes sense. So since we're passing in the amount here, amount makes sense. Something like some number would be valid, but wouldn't make a lot of sense, I guess. So I'll revert that. Now, therefore, in expense item, we can not just output props title, but also props amount. And here for the date, props.date.toISOstring. And that means we can now get rid of these three constants here. since we now get all the data we need from outside this component. We're not defining it inside of the expense item component, inside of this function, but instead it's in the end defined in app.js and passed into expense item for the different usages of expense item through attributes. And that's how you share data between React components. You can make your components truly reusable and configurable by using this props concept, which is one of the key concepts React has to offer. You'll use props all the time, so keep it in mind. It's super important. Props is a super important concept because it allows you to make your components reusable and it allows you to pass data from another component to this component. And hence, if we now have a look, we see these different expenses are rendered with different titles, different dates, and different amounts. Now that we learn about props, we're basically done with our first custom component. This expense item component is now reusable, and we can use this props concept to configure it differently every time that we're using it, so that the 4 times we're using expense item here, we're also getting a different output 4 times. I also just want to emphasize again that here we are indeed setting the values for the props dynamically with this single curly brace syntax, but we could also just have a hard-coded value like this here, if that is what we needed. So props are not limited to dynamically set values. We can do that, but we don't have to. The main idea behind props is always the same though. We want to make sure that we can pass data into our components to make them configurable and reusable. Now let's continue working on that expense item component and let's continue working on that date. Because at the moment, this is clearly not too pretty, not too human readable. And instead of showing it like this, I instead want to have this calendar-like look, which you see here in this preview. I want to have my date look like that. And therefore, of course, we need to change that HTML code, that JSX code, and I'm using these terms interchangeably as well. We need to change that, which is responsible for outputting that date. And here, to build such a calendar look, we could say that inside of that main div, which should hold the overall date element, we want to have 3 individual divs like this, where the topmost div is responsible for outputting the month, the middle div is responsible for outputting the year, and the bottom div then shows the day. That's something we could do. And of course, for that, we want to extract month, year, and day from the incoming date. So from that date prop which we're setting. For that here, for the month, we can output a value dynamically in access props.date. And now what? How can we now output the month here? Well, we can use a built-in method which is accessible on all date objects in JavaScript. We can call the toLocaleString method. Now, this is not a React-specific method. You can Google for JS toLocaleString to find an official article on this method. And this method simply helps you with outputting dates in human-readable formats. And you can simply call it and then pass in 2 arguments, where the first argument is basically the language. And here I'll use ENUS to go with English. And then the second argument is an object where you configure how specifically that date should be formatted. And here we got different options where you can find more details in that article which you can find. Here you can learn more about the various ways of configuring this and using this. And here we can set month to long, for example. That's one of the provided options or one of the supported options. And if we do that and save this, we see that August and March and June are being output here, so that we got a human readable way of outputting that month. Now, doing that all in line here in that JSX code clearly works. As I mentioned earlier when I introduced this syntax, you can have expressions like this between the curly braces, but it is considered a better practice and it leads to cleaner code if you extract logic like that and don't put it into your JSX code, but instead you create a separate helper variable or constant. Something like month here, which simply holds that value. And then here between your curly braces in the JSX code, you just point at that helper variable or constant. By doing it like this, you keep your JSX code lean and you have your more complex logic in the rest of this function so that this overall is easier to read. And now we can do something similar for the day and the year. For the day, we can access props.date to local string enus. And then here pass in a configuration where we say that we want to format just the day and output it in a 2-digit format. And we can add a year helper constant where we access props.date and then actually just access getFullYear, which is another built-in method which just extracts the year as a 4-digit number. And now we can use these helper constants to output their values like this in our JSX code. And if we do that and save that file, now we see the month, the year, and also the day in the month. And that's the raw data which I want to have here. Now, of course, one crucial thing is missing, and that would be the styling. But before we add that, let's talk about splitting components. As you work on your React application and on your React components, you will notice in any project that your components eventually become bigger and bigger as you have more and more logic and JSX code in them. This is something which will naturally happen. That is why React has this component concept. This allows you to split your application into smaller building blocks where every building block, every component is focused on one core task, you could say. And then you build your overall user interface by combining these building blocks. By doing that, you keep every component on its own relatively small and manageable, and you keep its code base small and manageable, and you still can build a complex user interface. Now, there is no hard rule when to build a new component versus adding more to an existing component. But in this component here, in this expense item component, we could already argue that it's getting a little bit too big, though I will say that this is definitely still all right. Nonetheless, we could argue that this date object here, this calendar item which we want to show on the user interface, could be treated as a separate component. Of course, the same case could be made for the title or the amount, or title and amount combined. As I said, there is no hard rule. But since for this calendar, we'll have a couple of helper constants and we'll have extra styles, I personally like to split this expense item component here into two components. The expense item component, which we already have, and then a new component for rendering this date in this calendar item look. And therefore, we're now going to create our second custom component. And for that, I'll create a new file in the components folder, and I'll name it expensedate.js. Now, as always, the file name is up to you, but I recommend that you follow this convention of naming it like this, starting with a capital character, one word, with every extra word also starting with a capital character. And again, it should also express what's happening inside of that file, what that component will be about. And this component will be about rendering the date of an expense. Hence, this sounds like a fitting name to me. Now in there, we create a new component, and that still is a function. Components in React are just regular functions with the extra twist of returning this JSX code. Now I'll name it expense state, again following this convention that we repeat the file name here, and I'll then export it to make it reusable outside of this file, like this. Now in here, I wanna calculate month, day, and year, so I'll cut this logic from expense item and move it to expense date. And therefore, of course, I need to accept props as a parameter here. And I do now expect that this component will be used such that a date prop is set. Now in expense item, I want to use this new component. But before we do that, I will actually grab this div with the month, year, and day inside of it and cut it as well and return that as JSX code inside of expense state.js. And now in expense item, at the top, we can add an import and import expense state from /expense state, like this. /expense state because we're looking in the same folder as the expense item.js file lives in. And now here, where we previously had our JSX code for the date, we instead output this expense state component. And as a side note, if you have a component that has no content between the opening and closing tags, you can also write it a little bit differently. You can write it as a self-closing element like this. This is then also okay. And we could do the same here in app.js with the expense item, since this also has no content between opening and closing tag. This is totally optional, but it is quite common to do that if there is no content between the opening and closing tag. So now we're using expense state in the expense item component. And we're doing this to move some of the JSX code and JavaScript logic out of the expense item into a separate component. This component is now again also reusable, and we can use it anywhere in this React application, not just in expense item. We could use it elsewhere as well if we wanted to. And it now also helps us with keeping expense item lean. This is now again shorter and therefore maybe a bit easier to maintain and manage. And the bigger your application gets and your components become, the more you want to look into splitting them up. Though again, just to really emphasize this, there is no hard rule on when to split. This is something which will come with experience, and you'll also see plenty of examples throughout this course. Now we must not forget though that our new expense date component needs a prop. It needs the date prop, at least that's the name I'm referring to here inside of expense date, to, well, extract that date and format it and extract the month, day, and year. Hence, on expense item or in expense item, when we use expense date, we should set the date prop. And if you used a different name here in expense date, you of course want to use a different name here instead of date as well. Now the value which I pass here will just be props.date. And I know that this is now the point where it can get confusing, because now we're basically funneling some data through multiple levels of components. In the end, we can see this component tree come to life now, because now we don't just have the app component and then one other custom component, but we have multiple custom components and they are nested inside of each other. Just to make this really clear again, in the app component, we're using the expense item component, and inside of the expense item component, we're using the expense state component. And not just that, we're also forwarding our data with the help of props through multiple components. We're passing data from the app component into expense item, and in expense item, we're outputting some of that data, but other parts of the data, to be precise, the date, which we here also already received through props, is then forwarded even further into the expense state component, again by using props. Because props are our way of passing data from component A to B. And it's also totally fine to have a component which just passes data on. So in the end, you could say we pass data from app to expense state, the date to be precise, is passed on, and we passed it on through expense item. Because that's how props work. We pass data from a component to a direct child component, so to a component which is used in that other component's JSX code, and we can't skip such a component. So if the date should be passed to expense date in the end, here in this case, since we use expense date instead of expense item, we first of all have to pass that data to expense item and then forward it to expense date. I hope this is clear. If it's not entirely clear yet, that's also something you're going to see in great detail and in many examples throughout the course. Okay, but with that we are forwarding the date and we get this separate component now. If we now save that all, we again see our date data being output here. Now we also want to have some styling, and therefore I'll add a new file, the expense date.css file, and you again find that file attached. You can just replace yours with it or open it and copy everything you find in the attached file into your expense date.css file. And once you did that, you can go to the expense date.js file, and at the very top of that file, import /expense date.css to make the entire project setup aware of that CSS file, and then add a couple of CSS classes here. On the surrounding div, we add a class name of expense-date, for example. On that month div, we add expense-date __ month. For the year div, we add expense-date __ year. And for the day, we add expense date __ day. And here I imported the wrong file. This should of course be expense date CSS. And with all of that done, if we save this, now we got this nice look here for our dates. And this looks much nicer, and we also practiced how we can add yet another component. And adding this component was optional. We could have put everything into expense item, the entire JSX code, which we have in a separate component now, the helper constants. We could have added this all into one component. We could have also added the CSS code here in the expense item CSS code. But then this expense item component would become bigger and bigger. And whilst in this case it would have still been fine, it is generally a good practice to keep your components small and focused, and that is why we did extract this extra component here.